Risk-based testing fills that gap because we rely on interviews and other kinds of interaction with the stakeholders to identify risks. The risks are not identified purely from an analysis of the requirement specifications. So that helps to fill that gap. So it does tend to be a nice, robust approach to doing testing. Because of the sequencing of the tests in risk priority order, it tends to find bugs in priority order as well. It's find the scary stuff first, I think, is a good rule of thumb for testers. Many of us have been through this, and I've certainly been through it as a test manager. You go into a project status meeting, it's towards the end of the project, and you come up with this big hairy bug that you just found, and then the project team's reaction is, oh God, why are we hearing about this for the first time right now, right? Everybody hates that. So how do you avoid that? Well, you can't be guaranteed to avoid that, but you would like to try to avoid that, and running the tests in risk order will help avoid that because you're more likely to find the more important bugs earlier. Estimation and planning. It would be nice to be able to talk about why you're going to test what you're going to test and why it's going to take as long as it's going to take in terms that people will understand, right? And if you can talk about this is what we need to do to cover these risks, and if we reduce the scope of testing, that's going to necessarily increase our risk exposure in these particular areas. You now have a way of discussing and negotiating a test estimate and a test plan in terms that management will relate to, in terms of risk. Because the stakeholders are involved in the process of determining what the risk items are and what the level of risk is, you now have aligned stakeholder expectations on what's going to be tested, how much, and in what order, right? A lot of times to people outside of testing, the whole planning and estimation process is just opaque to them. And they're like, well, testing's this magic box the product is supposed to come into with bugs and leave without bugs, right? And that poor grasp of the process leads to bad expectations. So having people involved in deciding what's going to be tested, how much, in what order helps get those expectations aligned. And as I mentioned before, changing project priorities, changing schedules. If we get squeezed, if the project priorities change, risk-based testing will respond in a robust manner to that. So for that reason, I think it's a best practice. Clear metrics-based test objectives. Now, so this gets back to this issue of stakeholder expectations. A lot of people do have that magic box expectation about testing, that product goes in with bugs, it comes out of the end with no bugs. If that's not what's happening, the box is broken, right? Or another way of thinking about that is the shield expectation, that the testing process is an impenetrable bug shield, right? And any bug coming into the testing process will hit the bug shield and bounce out, right? These are unrealistic expectations that anybody involved in testing or quality management for any length of time knows are unrealistic, but unfortunately a lot of people don't know that, and so they have these expectations. So what can we do? Well, what we can do is we can talk about objectives, and starting with external objectives, external being visible to people outside of the test team, stuff they care about, right? They want us to find defects. They want to build confidence in the system for release. They want to get the quality risks down to an acceptable level, right? They want good information so that they can make smart decisions. These are typical objectives that external stakeholders would have. So if we can define those objectives and then start to build some metrics around those and some targets for those metrics, we can actually talk about the test process being successful in objective, measurable terms. We're not talking about people's impressions, people's opinions, whether they're happy or sad about what's going on with testing, right? It's become a measurable thing. Now, there are internal objectives that support achieving these goals, which we'll look at in a minute, because this gets to how you improve the test process. But for the moment, I'm talking about the external goals, the externally visible objectives. And this really relates to another concept that I'll just touch on here. I don't want to get into this too much, but this idea of a test policy. Ideally, these metrics and these objectives and the metrics that are associated with them would be written down in a test policy document that say, you know, it is a policy of this organization to use testing to accomplish the following things. You lay out the objectives. You say, this is how we're going to measure success. These are the targets for our metrics. So let's take a look at an example of that. If we say our objective is to find important defects. Well, the question is, how effective are we at finding those important defects, right? There's also an efficiency question which we could look at, but let's focus on the effectiveness question first. How effective are we? So we can say, let's use a defect detection effectiveness metric, which we can define as, you know, take the number of test defects, divide that by the number of test defects plus the number ultimately found by the customer. Now, this has a couple assumptions underneath it, this metric. One is that there is some characteristic period of time in which the customers are going to report most of the defects that matter to them. And for most products, that can be anywhere from a few weeks to as long as a few years. So you need to do some study to determine what that period is. How long, if you look at the products that you have, pick a product, look at how long it took for 80% of the field identified failures to be reported. That's a pretty good time window to say, okay, this is when we're going to take our snapshot of what the number of customer defects is. Now, the other thing is that notice that we're making the assumption that the only defects that matter are ones that are found by test or found by a customer, right? So this is kind of like, well, what about the latent defects that never result in any failures? Well, you know what? I guess they're not important, so we're not too worried about those. Now, so this defect detection effectiveness metric is one that we've looked at with a number of clients, and it does tend to vary, and it can vary based on industry, but we found that 85% seems to be about average, 85% defect detection effectiveness. 90% is good. 95% is very good. We have clients that routinely score as high as 99% defect detection effectiveness. And by routinely, I mean, you know, project after project, they can do this. It's quite a trick. There are a lot of issues related to stability of process, stability of team, maturity of product, and so forth that are behind that. It's also just having a really good test organization. Now, another thing to look at, not only do you want to have a DDE target overall, but you also want to say my DDE, my defect detection effectiveness, for my high priority defects should be higher than my overall DDE, right? The process, my test process should be skewed towards finding the higher priority bugs, right? And so it's easy to tweak this metric. Just run it once for all bugs, and then run it again just for the high priority bugs, however you want to define that. And the DDE for the high priority bugs should be higher. And if you're doing risk-based testing properly, you're focusing in the right places, it will be. This is actually one of the key indicators that we use to check to see if an organization's risk-based testing is working, is the DDE inversion problem. Okay, now so that's DDE is an example of a metric that can be attached to an objective, and the objective is very clearly measurable through that metric. There are other metrics, or there are other objectives, excuse me, that where we have to get a little bit more creative about the metrics, and it's a little more subjective. So, for example, think about this objective, providing critical information during the project. So we want to know how good of a job are we doing, how effective are we at giving project team members the information that they need to make decisions in terms of our test results, right? So the metric here, stakeholder satisfaction with the test results reporting. And the way that we have done this for a number of clients on assessments is ask the stakeholders to react to 3 statements. And when I say react, I'm talking about react on a 5-point scale ranging from strongly agree down to strongly disagree, okay? But strongly agree, agree, neutral, disagree, strongly disagree. The 3 statements